The morning mist clung to the jagged peaks of the Sierra Madre Oriental like ghostly fingers, shrouding the treacherous mountain pass that would soon echo with the thunder of cannon and the screams of dying men. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna stood atop the rocky outcropping of Cerro Gordo, his weathered hands gripping his telescope as he surveyed the narrow defile below. The date was April 17, 1847, and the fate of Mexico itself hung in the balance. Santa Anna's dark eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he observed his masterfully chosen defensive position. The road to Mexico City wound through this mountain pass like a serpent, flanked by steep cliffs and dense chaparral that would funnel any attacking force into a deadly bottleneck. His artillery pieces, positioned on the commanding heights, could rain destruction upon any army foolish enough to attempt passage. Behind him, nearly 12,000 Mexican soldiers waited in their trenches and fortifications, their bayonets glinting in the pale dawnlight. The one-legged general, who had lost his limb fighting French invaders at Veracruz 6 years earlier, felt the familiar surge of confidence that had carried him through countless battles. He had defeated the Texans at the Alamo, crushed rebellions across Mexico, and now he would stop the American invasion dead in its tracks. The gringos had landed at Veracruz under General Winfield Scott just weeks ago, but their march inland would end here, in these unforgiving mountains where Mexican blood and Mexican steel would defend the sacred soil of the fatherland. Far below, in the valley, the vanguard of Scott's army approached like a blue uniformed tide. Major General David Twiggs led the advance division, his soldiers road-weary and dust-covered from their grueling march through the coastal lowlands. The American force numbered nearly 9,000 men, but as they gazed up at the seemingly impregnable Mexican positions, doubt crept into even the bravest hearts. The rocky heights bristled with cannon, and the narrow pass offered no room for maneuver. According to historical accounts preserved in the National Archives, the Mexican position at Cerro Gordo was considered virtually unassailable by military experts of the era. The fortifications commanded every approach, and Santa Anna had wisely placed his artillery to create overlapping fields of fire that would devastate any frontal assault. General Scott himself rode forward to reconnoiter the enemy positions, his practiced eye taking in every detail of the mountain fortress. At 61 years old, Old Fuss and Feathers had spent decades studying the art of war, and he recognized immediately that a direct attack would be suicidal. The Mexican general had chosen his ground well, transforming the natural mountain pass into a death trap that could swallow an entire army. As the sun climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the boulder-strewn landscape, both armies prepared for the coming battle. Mexican soldiers checked their muskets and said prayers to the Virgin of Guadalupe, while American engineers began the dangerous work of scouting alternative routes through the treacherous terrain. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic confrontations of the Mexican-American War, a battle that would determine whether the road to Mexico City remained open or closed forever. Captain Robert Edward Lee crouched behind a massive boulder, his keen eyes studying the precipitous terrain that rose like a wall of stone to the west of the Mexican positions. The young engineer officer, barely 40 years old but already renowned for his tactical brilliance, had volunteered for the most dangerous mission of his career. While Santa Anna's attention focused on the main road through the pass, Lee sought the impossible, a route that would allow American forces to outflank the seemingly impregnable fortress. The Virginia-born officer had graduated second in his class from West Point, and his methodical mind now dissected the landscape with scientific precision. Every gully, every ridge, every patch of scrub vegetation was cataloged and analyzed. The western slopes of Cerro Gordo appeared utterly impassable, a maze of vertical rock faces and dense chaparral that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. Yet somewhere in that forbidding wilderness lay the key to victory. Lieutenant Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, Lee's fellow engineer, joined him in the reconnaissance. The young Creole from Louisiana possessed an artist's eye for terrain, and together the two officers began to trace a path that existed more in hope than reality. They would have to cut through thorny underbrush, scale near vertical cliff faces, and somehow move artillery pieces through terrain that seemed designed by nature to repel invaders. Meanwhile, in the American camp below, General Scott paced before his assembled officers like a caged lion. The tall, imposing commander had built his reputation on bold strategic strokes, but the Mexican position presented challenges that tested even his considerable abilities. A frontal assault would result in catastrophic casualties, yet time was his enemy. Every day of delay allowed Santa Anna to strengthen his defenses and potentially receive reinforcements from the interior. "Gentlemen," Scott's voice carried the authority of decades of command, "we face an enemy who believes he has chosen the perfect battlefield. General Santa Anna thinks these mountains will be his salvation, but I intend to prove him wrong. Captain Lee has identified a route that may allow us to turn the enemy's flank, but it will require superhuman effort from our men." The plan that emerged from Scott's war council was audacious beyond measure. While Twiggs' division demonstrated against the Mexican front, creating the illusion of an impending frontal assault, a specially selected force would attempt the impossible flanking maneuver through the western mountains. The task fell to Brigadier General Gideon Johnson Pillow's brigade, supported by the artillery of Captain John Bankhead Magruder. As documented in Military Historian John S. D. Eisenhower's comprehensive study, "So Far from God: The U.S. War with Mexico," the engineering feat contemplated by Scott's forces represented one of the most daring tactical gambles in American military history. The route identified by Lee required soldiers to drag cannon up slopes so steep that pack animals could not navigate them. The night of April 17th passed with feverish activity in the American lines. Pioneer companies worked in darkness, hacking pathways through the chaparral with axes and machetes. Ropes and pulleys were rigged to haul artillery pieces up impossible inclines. Soldiers stripped to their shirt sleeves despite the mountain chill, their bodies streaming with sweat as they transformed Lee's theoretical route into brutal reality. By dawn of April 18th, the impossible had begun to take shape. High above the main Mexican positions, American soldiers clung to rocky ledges like human flies, their blue uniforms barely visible against the stone. Artillery pieces that had seemed destined to remain in the valley now perched on mountain peaks, their bronze barrels glinting in the morning sun. The trap was being set, and Santa Anna remained blissfully unaware that his impregnable fortress was about to be turned inside out. The first cannon shot shattered the mountain stillness at precisely 6:30 in the morning of April 18th, 1847. The thunderous roar echoed off the canyon walls like the voice of an angry god, and for a moment, both armies froze in stunned silence. Then chaos erupted across the battlefield as the impossible became terrifyingly real. General Santa Anna whirled toward the sound, his face contorting with disbelief and rage. The cannon fire had not come from the expected direction of the main road, but from high above his supposedly secure left flank. American artillery, impossibly positioned on the western heights, began raining death upon his carefully prepared positions. How had the gringos managed to scale those vertical cliffs? How had they dragged their guns up slopes that mountain goats would refuse to climb? Captain Magruder's battery unleashed a devastating barrage from their elevated position, each shot carefully aimed at the Mexican artillery emplacements below. The bronze Napoleon cannons, hauled up the mountain through superhuman effort, now commanded the entire battlefield. Mexican gunners, caught completely off guard, scrambled to reposition their pieces, but they were trapped in a deadly crossfire between the American guns above and Twiggs' advancing division below. The sound of battle reached new crescendos as Mexican soldiers poured from their trenches, their officers shouting contradictory orders in the confusion. Some units tried to scale the western slopes to engage the American flanking force, while others maintained their positions facing the main road. The careful defensive plan that Santa Anna had crafted over weeks of preparation disintegrated in minutes as his army found itself fighting on two fronts simultaneously. Brigadier General Pillow's infantry, having achieved their impossible ascent during the night, now pressed their attack with the fury of men who had accomplished the inconceivable. The 2nd Tennessee Regiment, led by Colonel William Turrisdale, charged down the rocky slopes with wild rebel yells that would later echo through Civil War battlefields. Their bayonets glinted in the morning sun as they crashed into the confused Mexican defenders. According to contemporary battlefield accounts preserved in the Library of Congress, the Mexican resistance began to crumble as units found themselves isolated and surrounded. The 11th Mexican Infantry, positioned to guard against frontal assault, suddenly faced American soldiers attacking from behind. Panic spread through the ranks like wildfire as men realized their fortress had become a trap. General Scott, observing the battle from his command post, recognized the moment when victory balanced on a knife's edge. The flanking attack had achieved complete surprise, but success required perfect timing. If the Mexican army could recover from its initial shock and reorganize its defenses, the American assault might still fail. Scott raised his arm, and signal flags began waving frantically across the battlefield. The coordinated assault that followed demonstrated American military planning at its finest. While Pillow's men pressed their attack from the heights, Twiggs' division launched a frontal assault up the main road. The 7th Infantry Regiment, their bayonets fixed and their battle flags streaming, advanced into the jaws of the pass with disciplined precision. Mexican grapeshot tore bloody furrows through their ranks, but still they came, stepping over their fallen comrades with grim determination. Major General Gideon Pillow himself led the charge against the Mexican battery positioned on Telegraph Hill, the secondary peak that anchored Santa Anna's left flank. The former Tennessee politician had transformed himself into a warrior, his sword raised high as he urged his men forward. The battery, commanded by a young Mexican lieutenant whose name history would not preserve, fought with desperate courage. But they were overwhelmed by the tide of blue uniforms surging over their position. The collapse of Telegraph Hill marked the beginning of the end for Santa Anna's defense. With their left flank turned and their artillery positions compromised, Mexican units began to waver. The carefully constructed defensive lines that had seemed so formidable at dawn now became death traps as American forces pressed their advantage with relentless fury. General Santa Anna's wooden leg scraped against the rocky ground as he limped frantically from position to position, his voice hoarse from shouting orders that fewer and fewer of his men could hear above the din of battle. The elegant uniform that had gleamed so proudly at dawn was now torn and dust-covered, a fitting symbol of his crumbling defense. Around him, the army that had seemed invincible just hours before dissolved into chaos as American forces pressed. Their devastating advantage doubted the Mexican general's tactical genius, which had served him through decades of warfare, now worked against him as he grasped the full magnitude of his defeat. The Americans had not simply outflanked his position. They had rendered his entire defensive strategy obsolete with a single bold stroke. Every gun, every trench, every carefully sighted obstacle had been positioned to repel an attack from the east. Now, with American forces pouring down from the western heights, his fortress had become a prison. Captain Lee, still directing the movement of artillery pieces along his impossible mountain route, paused to observe the battle unfolding. Below, the young engineer's gamble had paid off beyond his wildest expectations. Mexican units, caught between hammer and anvil, were breaking in all directions. Some attempted to retreat along the main road toward Mexico City, while others fled into the trackless mountains where pursuit would be impossible. The 8th Infantry Regiment, part of Twiggs' frontal assault, finally broke through the Mexican lines guarding the main pass. Colonel Newman Clark, his sword bloody and his uniform rent by grapeshot, led his men in a wild charge that scattered the defenders like leaves before a hurricane. The road to Mexico City, blocked for precious hours by Santa Anna's mountain fortress, lay open once again, but the day's most dramatic moment was yet to come. As Mexican resistance crumbled across the battlefield, Santa Anna himself found his escape route threatened. American cavalry, having forced their way through the pass, now galloped hard along the mountain road in pursuit of the fleeing Mexican army. The one-legged general, unable to run like his younger officers, faced the very real possibility of capture. Major General David Twiggs, leading his victorious division up the main road, spotted the distinctive figure of the Mexican commander, struggling to reach his waiting carriage. The grizzled American officer, a veteran of the War of 1812, spurred his horse forward with a hunter's instinct. The capture of Santa Anna would be a prize beyond measure, potentially ending Mexican resistance with a single stroke. Historical records maintained by the Smithsonian Institution document the narrow escape that followed. As Santa Anna's loyal aide-de-camp, Colonel Jose Maria Guerrero sacrificed his own life to delay the American pursuit. The young officer threw himself between the approaching cavalry and his general's carriage, buying precious seconds with his blood. Santa Anna's ornate carriage, drawn by 4 magnificent horses, careened down the mountain road at breakneck speed. Inside, the Mexican general clutched his dispatch case containing the Army's most sensitive documents, including detailed maps of Mexico City's defenses. The carriage wheels struck rocks and bounced over ruts that threatened to overturn the vehicle at every turn, but somehow the driver maintained control. Behind them, American cavalry pressed the pursuit with desperate intensity. Captain Philip Kearny of the 1st Dragoons, his saber gleaming in the afternoon sun, closed the distance with each thundering hoofbeat. The young officer could see Santa Anna's white hair flowing in the wind as the Mexican general leaned out of his carriage window, urging his driver to greater speed. The chase reached its climax at a narrow bridge spanning a deep gorge. Santa Anna's carriage clattered across the wooden planks just as Kearny's dragoons reached the opposite side. For a moment, pursuer and pursued faced each other across the chasm, so close that they could see the whites of each other's eyes. Then Santa Anna's driver whipped his horses around a bend in the mountain road, and the Mexican general vanished into the shadows of the Sierra Madre Oriental. Though Santa Anna had escaped, he left behind more than his dignity. His personal effects, including his wooden leg and a chest containing 50,000 silver pesos, fell into American hands. More importantly, the defeat at Cerro Gordo had shattered the myth of Mexican invincibility and opened the road to the heart of their nation. The silence that settled over Cerro Gordo in the battle's aftermath seemed almost supernatural after hours of thunderous combat. Smoke drifted across the battlefield like morning fog, carrying the acrid scent of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood. American soldiers, their faces blackened with powder burns and their uniforms torn by thorns and bullets, began the grim task of tallying the victory's cost. General Scott rode slowly through the captured Mexican positions, his trained eye cataloging the magnitude of their triumph. 43 cannon, ranging from massive 24-pounders to light field pieces, now bore the American flag. 3,000 Mexican soldiers had been taken prisoner, including 5 generals whose gilded uniforms contrasted sharply with their dejected expressions. The road to Mexico City stretched ahead like an open invitation. Among the most prized captures was General Guerrero himself, the officer who had commanded Santa Anna's artillery. The dignified Mexican stood straight despite his wounds, refusing to show weakness before his captors. When brought before Scott, he surrendered his sword with the formal courtesy that marked professional soldiers of the era. Regardless of nationality, Captain Lee, exhausted from his night-long labors in the mountains, supervised the inventory of captured documents. Maps, orders, supply reports, and correspondence revealed the inner workings of Santa Anna's defensive strategy. Most valuable of all were the detailed plans of Mexico City's fortifications, intelligence that would prove crucial in the battles to come. The human cost of victory became apparent as burial details began their somber work. American casualties numbered fewer than 500 killed and wounded, a remarkably light toll considering the strength of the Mexican position. Mexican losses were far heavier, with over 1,000 dead scattered across the mountainside. The disparity reflected not just tactical superiority, but the devastating psychological impact of Scott's flanking maneuver. Private James Murphy of the 2nd Tennessee Regiment, one of the men who had scaled the impossible western slopes, sat on a captured cannon and penned a letter to his wife in Nashville. His hands shook as he wrote, whether from exhaustion or the lingering effects of battle. But his words captured the magnitude of what they had accomplished. "We have done the impossible, Sarah. We have taken a mountain fortress that seemed strong as Gibraltar itself." According to contemporary accounts published in the New York Herald, the victory at Cerro Gordo electrified American public opinion and demonstrated the growing military prowess of the young republic. The newspaper's correspondent, embedded with Scott's army, described the battle as a masterpiece of military engineering and tactical brilliance that will be studied in military academies for generations to come. The spoils of war extended beyond mere material gains. Among Santa Anna's abandoned personal effects, American soldiers discovered a collection of letters from his wife, Señora Inés Garcia, which revealed the Mexican general's private doubts about his nation's ability to resist the American invasion. These documents, though never publicly released, provided valuable insights into Mexican morale and strategic thinking. Perhaps most significantly, the victory shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Santa Anna since his triumph at the Alamo 11 years earlier. Mexican soldiers who had followed him through countless campaigns now whispered that their general had been outmaneuvered by younger, more innovative opponents. The psychological impact of defeat would prove as damaging as the material losses. General Scott, ever the politician as well as soldier, recognized the importance of magnanimous victory. He ordered that captured Mexican officers be treated with full military honors, and that wounded enemy soldiers receive the same medical care as American casualties. This gesture of respect did much to ease the bitterness of defeat and laid the groundwork for eventual reconciliation between the two nations. As night fell over the battlefield of Cerro Gordo, both armies contemplated the day's events from vastly different perspectives. The Americans had proven that no position was truly impregnable when faced with sufficient courage and ingenuity. The Mexicans had learned that traditional defensive strategies might prove inadequate against opponents willing to attempt the impossible. The road to Mexico City lay open, but the war was far from over. The dawn of April 19, 1847, revealed a transformed landscape at Cerro Gordo, where Mexican cannon had bristled from every height the day before. American flags now snapped in the mountain breeze. General Scott's army, flush with victory and laden with captured weapons, prepared to resume their march toward the heart of Mexico. The supposedly impregnable fortress had fallen in a single day, opening the gateway to the enemy capital. Scott himself stood atop the highest peak of Cerro Gordo, the same vantage point from which Santa Anna had surveyed his doomed defenses. The American commander's weathered face showed satisfaction as he contemplated the strategic implications of their triumph. Not only had they broken through the Mexican defensive line, but they had captured enough artillery and supplies to sustain their advance for weeks to come. The logistical challenges facing both armies were immense. Scott's force, operating hundreds of miles from their base at Veracruz, depended entirely on supplies carried by wagon train through hostile territory. The victory at Cerro Gordo had netted them vast quantities of Mexican ammunition and equipment, but feeding and caring for 3,000 prisoners stretched their resources to the breaking point. For the defeated Mexican army, The situation was even more desperate. Santa Anna's forces, scattered across the Sierra Madre Oriental, faced the daunting task of regrouping without adequate supplies or communication. Many units had simply melted away into the mountains, their soldiers deserting to return to their homes. The carefully constructed defensive line that was supposed to protect Mexico City had evaporated like morning mist. Captain Lee, promoted to brevet major for his role in discovering the flanking route, now turned his engineering skills to the more mundane task of road repair. The mountain passes, torn by cannon fire and the passage of armies, required extensive work before Scott's supply wagons could navigate them safely. Lee's men labored with picks and shovels, transforming a battlefield into a highway. The psychological impact of Cerro Gordo extended far beyond the immediate participants. News of the victory spread rapidly through Mexico, carried by fleeing soldiers and civilian refugees. In the capital, President Valentin Gómez Farias faced growing calls for his resignation as the reality of military defeat became undeniable. The Mexican Congress, which had rejected American peace overtures just weeks earlier, now began to reconsider their position. American morale, by contrast, soared to new heights. The volunteer regiments, many composed of men who had never seen combat before the war began, now marched with the confidence of veterans. They had proven themselves against seasoned Mexican regulars in the most challenging terrain imaginable. The road ahead might be long, but no obstacle seemed insurmountable after Cerro Gordo. According to diplomatic correspondence preserved in the State Department archives, the battle's outcome significantly altered the international perception of the Mexican-American War. European observers, who had initially expected Mexican forces to bog down the American invasion and costly mountain warfare, now began to reassess the military balance in North America. General Scott faced crucial decisions about his next moves. The direct route to Mexico City lay open, but his army needed time to rest and refit after their grueling campaign. More importantly, he had to decide what to do with the thousands of Mexican prisoners who could not be easily transported or adequately guarded during the advance. In a move that demonstrated both military pragmatism and political wisdom, Scott offered parole to captured Mexican officers who promised not to take up arms again during the current conflict. This policy, controversial among some American commanders who favored harsher treatment, reflected Scott's understanding that the war's ultimate goal was political settlement rather than total destruction of Mexican military capacity. The medical aftermath of battle also demanded attention. American field hospitals, hastily established in captured Mexican positions, worked around the clock to treat wounded soldiers from both armies. Dr. Jonathan Letterman, a young Army surgeon who would later revolutionize battlefield medicine during the Civil War, pioneered new techniques for treating gunshot wounds in the challenging mountain environment. As Scott's army prepared to resume their advance, the broader implications of Cerro Gordo became clear. The battle had not merely opened the road to Mexico City. It had fundamentally altered the character of the entire war. What had begun as a conflict between roughly equal opponents had become a demonstration of American military innovation and tactical flexibility that would reshape continental geopolitics for generations to come. 6 months after the last cannon fell silent at Cerro Gordo, General Winfield Scott stood in the Grand Plaza of Mexico City, accepting the surrender of the Mexican capital. The impossible flanking maneuver conceived by Captain Lee and executed by American soldiers had proven to be the key that unlocked not just a mountain pass, but an entire nation. The road that began with scaling those forbidding cliffs had led inevitably to the halls of Montezuma. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848, formally ended the Mexican-American War and transferred vast territories to the United States. From California to Texas, from Nevada to Arizona, the American flag now flew over lands that had been Mexican the day before. Cerro Gordo, The battle that had seemed like a tactical victory had become a strategic triumph of continental proportions. Captain Robert E. Lee, now Brevet Colonel Lee, found himself transformed from a promising young engineer into one of America's most celebrated military minds. His daring reconnaissance and route finding at Cerro Gordo would be studied in military academies for decades to come. Ironically, the tactical brilliance he displayed against Mexican forces would later be turned against his own nation when he chose to follow Virginia into the Confederacy. 14 years later, the veterans of Cerro Gordo carried their memories of the impossible climb and devastating victory into civilian life across America. In Tennessee, Private James Murphy opened a general store and regaled customers with tales of scaling vertical cliffs in darkness. In Virginia, Sergeant William Hayes became a schoolteacher and used the battle to illustrate lessons about courage and innovation to successive generations of students. General Santa Anna, his political career shattered by military defeat, lived out his days in exile, his wooden leg a constant reminder of battles won and lost. The limb captured at Cerro Gordo became a trophy displayed in American museums, a macabre symbol of Mexican defeat. Yet history would remember Santa Anna not just as a defeated general, but as a complex figure who embodied both the possibilities and limitations of his era. The engineering techniques pioneered during the flanking maneuver at Cerro Gordo influenced American military doctrine for generations. The willingness to attempt seemingly impossible tactical solutions became a hallmark of American military thinking, from the Civil War battlefields of Gettysburg and Antietam to the 20th century campaigns of World War II and beyond. From Mexico, Cerro Gordo marked the end of an era and the beginning of a painful period of national introspection. The loss of half their national territory forced Mexican leaders to confront fundamental questions about their political and military institutions. The defeat catalyzed reforms that would eventually transform Mexico into a more modern and unified nation. Though the process would take decades to complete, the mountain battlefield itself became a pilgrimage site for military historians and tourists alike. The impossible route that Lee had traced through the western cliffs was marked with monuments commemorating American ingenuity and Mexican valor. Veterans from both armies sometimes returned to walk the ground where they had fought, their former enmity tempered by shared respect for the courage displayed on both sides. In the broader context of American expansion, Cerro Gordo represented a watershed moment when the young republic proved it could project military power across vast distances and overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. The confidence gained from victories like Cerro Gordo would fuel American ambitions throughout the 19th century. From the California Gold Rush to the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, the battle's legacy extended beyond military history into the realm of engineering and exploration. The techniques developed for moving artillery through impossible terrain influenced the construction of mountain railroads and the opening of the American West. Lee's methodical approach to reconnaissance became standard practice for Army engineers, facing similar challenges in the Rocky Mountains and Sierra Nevada. Today, visitors to the Cerro Gordo battlefield can still trace the route that Lee's engineers carved through the mountain wilderness. Bronze plaques mark key positions where American and Mexican soldiers fought and died, their sacrifices remembered by both nations as part of a shared history that transcended the bitterness of war. The impossible had become inevitable, and the gates to Mexico City had been opened by courage, innovation, and the refusal to accept that any position was truly impregnable. The thunder of cannon that echoed through the Sierra Madre Oriental on April 18, 1847, had faded into memory, but its reverberations continued to shape the destiny of North America for generations to come.